I'm Daniel Cole. I'm an executive in Accenture's communications media technology practice. I focus primarily on our hard tech clients, really around the areas of talent and organization. So I'm currently working with a few different clients on, how do they accelerate from a mergers and acquisitions perspective? So integrating companies into their current processes and getting them accelerated. So I'm pretty excited to talk to you guys and discuss all these things.
Wonderful. We're so happy that you're taking time out of your Sunday to spend with us and talk with us. Daniel is also the head of the Northern California African American Employee Resource Group at Accenture. So he is very connected to the diversity movement and very in tune with what's on people's hearts and minds in terms of diversity within the corporate world. But as we all know, there's a very thin membrane, right, between our work life and our personal life and who we are. So I feel really honored to have you here, Daniel, and I just can't thank you enough.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and my brother Kimani is with me again, as always, my co-host, my ride or die. And we're just excited to kick it off with the first question, which is from your lived experience, from your vantage point, what's hurting Black men?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about it the last few seconds, as you brought up the question. And I think if you think about everything we're dealing with right now, it does stem from history, right? And I think there's oftentimes, and people want to downplay it, people want to ignore it, people want to say, well, what about now? And it's all fine, but there is a history of oppression and systematic things that have been done to keep, whether it's Black men out of the families, whether it's Black men in prison, whether it's Black men without jobs. There's been a structural and intentional thing that has plagued us, right? And if your father didn't have a father, or your father's father didn't have a father who taught him how to be a father, how to be a man, how to raise a family, where does he learn that from, right? If he was in prison, where does he learn how to be a man from, right? Where does generational wealth come from, right? If you don't have the money to go to a good school, to open yourself up to opportunities, what are the chances that your kid has? And I've talked to a few different people, when I go to Ghana, for example, and I see, there's extreme levels of poverty there, and you see people being born into that. And you look at them and it's heartbreaking, because that this person is going to forever be behind the curve for nothing that they've done, for no reason, for no fault of their own. They are going to be behind the curve because they're growing into a system that they're already behind. Their parents are poor, young, maybe father's not around, et cetera. So that history has followed us. And I think until we acknowledge it, right, there's a part of us that has to acknowledge it, but then there's a part of us that has to work against it in some ways, right? And figuring out, okay, now that we've acknowledged that, hey, things just suck, right? Historically, things have sucked for us. Things have not been on our side. But what do we do going forward, right? And I think, being the child of an immigrant, right? I grew up with, racism is a thing, yes, but you have to move on. You have to ignore it. You have to and I think a lot of immigrants grow up with that mentality of, yes, there's racism world, but you're not going to change that. So what can you do, right? And so that's why they work really hard. They don't worry about who doesn't like them, who says what about them, right? And they're just, I'm going to progress forward. And I think for a lot of people, particularly Black Americans and Black American men, it is hard to have that mentality, because you don't have somebody who says, hey, there's racism, but forget about that. You need to work hard. You need to do your best, right? And we, there's the theory about you have to be twice as good to be, recognized. And can we say that everybody is actually twice as good, right? Can we honestly say that everybody is working twice as hard as everybody else? And I don't know we can honestly say that, right? I think there's some people who are working twice as hard, and maybe they're only getting half the credit they deserve. And I think that's a legitimate thing that we have to address. But until more of us are working twice as hard to really, whether it's improving ourselves or improving the families that are around us, the communities that are around us, we're always going to be behind the 8 ball. Because once you're already behind, the only way that you can catch up is if you, something has to give, right? Either oppressors stop oppressing, or you find a way of catching up, to the oppressor, right? And so I think from my perspective, that's kind of where I think the challenges are. And that's not to say that it's our fault, right? I don't think it's, it is Black people's fault that we have been oppressed for hundreds of years, right? I'm not Kanye or any of these other people that it's a choice, right? I do believe that we should lay blame with the oppressors. And that being said, we still have to do something about it, right?
That's a lot. Thank you. And I appreciate the like 30,000 foot view, all encompassing, looking at it from, you know, a distance and saying it's all of these things. It's not one, it's not the other. It's all of these things in combination.
Yeah.
I think that part of the reason I was so excited to talk to you is because I know that you are an immigrant and your family's from Ghana, and you bring a unique perspective. I remember hearing you when I first met you on the panel at Santa Clara University at their diversity conference, and you said that you didn't feel like you were really the right person to head the African American Employee Resource Group because you weren't born and raised here in the United States. And I thought, no, it's even better because you represent a different perspective and yet the same, like there's enough in common and there's enough that is fresh and unique and different. And in America, we're all immigrants from one generation or another, right? And there are plenty of people of African descent who are living here, who were not born and raised here, who, like you, have very similar values and perspectives and views. So thinking about that expression of having to work twice as hard to get half the credit or to get anywhere at all, I want to unpack that a little bit, because one of the things that comes to my mind, you know, you asked the question, is everybody working twice as hard? And my question is, can everybody work twice as hard? Does everybody have the capacity?
Right. Well, and I think twice as hard is relative, right? I think my twice as hard is very different than yours and very different from anybody else's. So I don't think it's you have to be working twice as hard as everybody else, but I think there is a can you do more, right? And I think that's where the twice as hard comes from, right? So if I take the example, I have coworkers, white coworkers, who they come to work, they do their job, they focus on the thing that they need to focus on at their level, and they go home, right? They don't actually have to worry about diversity initiatives. They don't have to spend time planning for Black History Month. They don't have to spend time, how do I mentor, a young Black man who comes into the company so that he can kind of be more successful, right? How do I take into account all of the environmental, structural, historical things that he brings with him as he comes to this company, and maybe he doesn't have anybody who's prepared him to be in the professional world, right? There are a lot of white coworkers who don't have to bear that burden at all, right? Like, they come to work and they don't have to worry about uplifting the entire white community or any of the white community, right? They do their job. If they don't like somebody or somebody's not pulling their weight, hey, get rid of them, right? Let's move on to the next person. So twice as hard for me is very different than twice as hard for somebody else, right? My twice as hard is I'm gonna have to do my day-to-day job, right? I'm gonna have to find ways to excel at that. And then I'm gonna have to find ways to mentor other people, right? And lift them up and provide them the insights or opportunities or the advice that, was helpful for me to overcome certain challenges. So I think everybody in their own little way can figure out what twice as hard is, right? And I think there are times where you can do stuff, and there are times where you're like, hey, I have a family, I have, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a sister, whatever. I have responsibilities outside of work, and sometimes I'm going to have to prioritize them. But I think where we can, we do have to figure out what are ways that we can help others and contribute back.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I agree.
Going back to what you were saying about not feeling like it's hard for you to represent the African American experience because you're an immigrant. I have a question for you. I mean, I know much of what happened in the United States happened in Africa too, which is a large part of the reason why people are so behind the eight ball and trying and can't break those barriers. And so, I mean, though you weren't born here, you still have to live in the same type of society. Okay, it's better because you have more Black people and you're running the country. You have more. The ceiling might feel a little bit higher for you because even though you're Black, but at the same time, there's still a lot of those same restraints that we have to deal with here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, definitely. And, so minor point of clarification. So I was born in LA, grew up in Inglewood, and then I went to high school in Ghana. So when I was growing up in LA, that was during Rodney King, O.J. Simpson, right? And I'm 9 or 10 at the time, right? So I have a very limited understanding of what exactly all of the dynamics are that are going on at that time, right? And I'm aware in general, I had a Black teacher in 4th grade, Mrs. Jones, who was really passionate about teaching us about slavery and, all of the things that happened during the slave trade, et cetera, right? So I had a general understanding racism exists. There's all these bad things that have happened to Black people. But I don't think you fully appreciate it until you do more exploration into just all the different structural things that were put in place to prevent Black people from succeeding, right? It wasn't just that, hey, Black people are slaves and they don't have, they're not paid a lot of money. They work the cotton farms, they go home, and that's kind of it, right? It was what happened during Jim Crow, what's happened since then with redlining, with all these other, terrible practices that we've seen going on. And I think those are all things that perpetually keep us behind, right? And I think that we have a responsibility to try and figure out, as a community, what do we do to overcome this on our own, right? And people look to different cultures who have come here as oppressed cultures and have rallied together, have prioritized economic empowerment in their own communities, and that have been able to sort of overcome those challenges, right? And I think that that's what we have to figure out. How do we do that? And I think because of that disconnect between maybe immigrants and natural, or I don't even know the proper term, but African Americans who've just been here a longer time, there is that feeling of we are not going through the same struggle. And maybe we're not going through the same struggle, right? But there's a common ultimate goal, right? Which is we all want to do better for ourselves, and we want to do better for our families and for our future generations. And so if we can rally around that part, right? And then figure out, okay, how do we then proceed from there? And I think, it's going to be a hard thing to tell somebody who, if your father went through Jim Crow, right? And to be fair, 1965 or 1970 was only 50 years ago, right? So we are old enough, like my father was born in 1940, right? So my father was an adult when, all these terrible things were happening, and he came to America and was trying to make a way for himself, right? So it is not to say that our parents who have grown up through some of these terrible things and have taught us about, hey, this is what I went through, this is what I struggled through, we can't forget that, right? And we can't dismiss that as that's a thing that just happened back then, but we're over it, right? And we have to figure out, like, well, what do we do now with that pain, with that, all those emotions and all those things that happened before?
Yeah.
I'm glad you put it in that historical context as well, because it's literally less than one lifetime.
Right.
Since the civil rights movement, less than one lifetime. The people who led the civil rights movement, many of them are still here with us today. And so how much change can we expect in less than one lifetime, right? That's a question that I always ask myself. And then the other thing is just this difference in perspective, right? From the immigrant perspective versus those who have been here, whose families have been here for, generations and perhaps hundreds of years. I think that, and this came up in our last conversation too, I think a lot of times we in our generation tend to look back, we look at our current circumstances, we look back maybe one, maybe two generations, and we sort of frame this perspective about what is and isn't being done, or what has and hasn't been done. But just kind of going back to this idea of working twice as hard, and how you break down, how you break the cycle, right, of institutionalized racism, of the attacks and the affronts that are against us on so many different levels, right? It is economic, it is social, it is, in terms of owning land and education and, destroying the family unit. Every aspect of humanity is under assault in one way or another for Black people in this country. And when I think historically, I think back to the Reconstruction era and all of the advances that Black folks had, immediately after slavery was abolished. We had Black professionals immediately after. We had Black scholars immediately after. We had Black mayors and business owners and postmasters and everything in any community that makes a community run was run by Black people because of Jim Crow. And so we had to have Black professionals across every profession, from doctors to farmers, right? And
Yeah.
so it's not that we haven't accomplished those things, and it's not that we haven't accomplished those things against tremendous odds, right? We accomplished the things when there were still lynchings, when the KKK was still free to roam and burn down communities. And we have built and rebuilt over and over and over again. And I think about, the Harlem Renaissance. I think about Frederick Douglass. I think about the Black Power movement of the 70s. We have rebuilt over and over and over again. And every single time there have been, like you said, those systematic or systemic institutional mechanisms in place to hold us back, whether it was redlining or too many to even name, right? But we're aware of all of them, right? And
Prison
now
industrial complex, right? We have the drug epidemic,
right.
putting liquor stores in certain neighborhoods, grocery deserts, we can go down the list, right? And I think we can't pretend that those things don't exist, right? But what does that mean for us, right? And I think we have to, Melanie Dobson, she's a wife of George Lucas. She's also really big in the finance, private equity, sort of that field there. And she gave a TED talk, and she talked about how she could be really good at being a teacher, right? But she's like, is that really the best use of my skills? And, she would argue, no, right? It's being able to be in these corporate boardrooms. It's being able to sort of help change the narrative. It's being able to help have resources that can provide, capital and all these other opportunities for people that maybe don't have this opportunity, don't have this capability, right? And so we really have to think about, what are our capabilities? What are we good at? Where can we channel our energy, right? And everybody can't be a rapper. Everybody can't be a basketball player. We all can't be lawyers and doctors, right? And we need people who run grocery stores, right? We need people who, can start a bank and who can start a floral shop, right? Or whatever it is that a community needs to kind of grow and develop, right? And there's no shame in any of those professions, right? And I think there's a thinking in our community that if you're not one of these top 5, 10 things that we can aspire to, right? If you're not a lawyer, doctor, basketball player, rapper, this, that, then you're not important, right? And there's nothing wrong with being employed, taking care of your family, providing for them, preparing for the future, preparing for the next generation. And the more we start to make that the goal and the ideal, then it becomes a different conversation, right? Because then you're not as worried about, well, do they think I have the best clothes, or do they think about this or that, right? It's, I'm doing this thing that is taking care of my family, and that's really important to me.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely. What you brought up, living in LA during the Rodney King and the riots, and it's funny you brought that up because my daughter just did a presentation on that for History Month.
Yeah.
Or a history competition for and she just moved on to state with it. But part of what they were asking us to do, or asking her to do, was to come up with the negatives and the positives. And we were both sitting there, me, my wife, and my daughter, and we were trying to figure out what the positive was. What came out of it that helped us in the long run. And we really struggled to try to figure that out. And I think that kind of speaks to, in my opinion, what's holding Black men back in this country, is that we've seen stuff like that happen, and we've seen the oppression and the racism and the drugs and everything else that's happened to hold us back. And we've seen our parents go through the struggle and march and do all that stuff. And I think part of what hip hop in general is, which is, what I consider our generation, is it's rebellion against that, because it wasn't moving fast enough. It wasn't doing what we wanted. And even when we did do it, they took action to break those things down. And at some point, I feel like through drugs and through just the everyday struggle, most Black men are just like, you know what, screw it. I'm just gonna do me. I'm gonna get as much money as I can, whichever way I can, and I'm gonna raise myself up. And that, through the process of believing in that and learning that, you start downplaying the morals and the family and all the other things that you have to sacrifice to get to that place.
Yeah.
I think that's a real big thing that I've noticed, especially with a lot of my friends, where, you know, they could do a lot more with their kids, their sons, in certain aspects, and they're like, no, I have to get out there and get the money. The money, I have to have that money, because that's the only thing that's going to get me to a place where I can compete and elevate myself, you know?
No, and I think, you know, there's, you know, in this day and age with the cost of schooling and education, you know, I'm lucky that I had family that was able to help support me through college, you know, and I still had to take out loans and I still had to figure out ways to pay them back. And so, you know, there's all these financial pressures that are on people that maybe they weren't on people 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? Because the cost of living, the cost of schooling, all these things were so much more affordable. And so you have somebody who's looking at it as, I can't afford $20,000, $30,000 a year in college, but I can do this or I can do that. And so, you know, for lack of a better term, right, they're taking the easy way out, right? Because this is something that I can see, this is something that's reasonable or attainable in my mind. And this other thing is not attainable, right? And so we need people to show them that, hey, it is attainable, right? And that's, if you think about the importance of Barack Obama becoming elected, right? Apart from the pure policy decisions that you may or may not agree with, it's the fact that there's a generation of people who never thought they would see a Black president, right? Never thought that would happen. And now they see that, and you have kids growing up who legitimately can feel like, I can one day be president. And I think that that's a powerful thing, right? And so we need to have more of those kind of role models where it's, I can now be not just Supreme Court justice, but I can be a lawyer. I can be, you know, I can run a business and be successful in my neighborhood, right? I don't have to do something illegal to do that, right? And it's not just a liquor store, this or that, right? And there are other opportunities for me. And encouraging entrepreneurship, right? Encouraging people to, like, you know, hustle. If we're already hustling, right? Why don't we just turn that hustle into something that's legitimate that, you know, won't send us to jail? And that's not just to say that is our only issue, right? And that is not to just say, you know, if we just stop hustling, we'll be okay, right? Like, there's far bigger and you know, tougher issues are out there. But that is an example of something that we can do that, you know, as a community can help, right? Is going back to the schools, going back and mentoring people, finding these organizations that we can support, and then sort of trying to help people, you know, prepare for the future.
Yeah, definitely. That's been my experience, you know, because I was running the streets. I was out there with my friends. I was selling drugs, and I had when I grew up, even though I grew up in an affluent community, and I had a mother who told me I could always do what I wanted, and I had family that backed me and people who loved me and supported me, just the feeling of the United States made me feel like I had no future.
Right.
You know, I when I was a kid, I never grew up like I was going to be this or that, or I was going to be this or that. You know, it was nothing. I was just surviving, trying to figure out how I was going to make it through and how I was going to grow up. And that took me straight to the streets.
Yeah.
And because of that, you know, I went down past it. I probably shouldn't have gone down. I shouldn't have gone down, but it was luckily because I had those people backing me, and I was able to see that wider view that you're talking about. You know what I'm saying? That I was able to step away from that and use the talents that I learned in the streets, as far as hustling, as far as meeting people, as far as being an entrepreneur, and started being able to turn that towards more positive things, like doing this, like, you know, building my own business and things like that. So I think hip hop is really helping in that aspect, as far as becoming entrepreneurs and monetizing our gifts.
Absolutely. And we're seeing that change, right? Where it's no longer just, I'm just a rapper, right? People are building a brand, they're building business. And you look at athletes now, they're not just athletes, right? They're, you know, Michael Jordan has shown us, Magic Johnson has shown us, hey, you can build a brand and you can own a team and you can, you know, be very influential in these various circles that extend outside of just your area of expertise, right? And so we need to make sure we're sharing that message, right? And we had a leadership summit last year at work, and one of the, you know, Black senior managing directors was talking about how business can be such a driver for good. And as he was saying it, I was like trying to think about what he was saying. And he was talking about how, look at in North Carolina or in Indiana, when they were going to pass those restrictive bathroom laws to say that transgender people can't use, certain bathrooms. Business communities were like, if you enact this law, we will pull our business out of your state. Mm-hmm. The NBA was like, if you enact this law, we will take All-Star Weekend away from Charlotte. Mm-hmm. All these companies came out and said, we will do this, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think those people who were for those policies, I don't think they stopped being for those policies, right? Yeah. But they realized there's an economic impact if I go through with this policy. And as much as I may hate transgender people, I love money so much more, right? And so I'm going to do this thing that keeps this money in my pocket. And I may have to be creative in how I oppress these transgender people, but I'm going to still take this money, right? And so we have to figure out, how do we work within that kind of framework of, okay, if we want something, we have to find a way of hitting people in the pocket for them to realize that, right? And we're seeing that a little bit with boycotting here and there, support Black businesses. But we need more influence, right? We need more to be able to bring more pressure onto these types of situations. And so that's where this message of economic empowerment, focusing on our communities, building them up, that's where that becomes really powerful. Because if a whole community says, hey, we're not going to tolerate this, right? Yeah. Think about what that does, right? And that really changes the conversation there. And I don't think right now we're in a position where people kind of will listen, right? Certain things, if we hear something that we don't really like, we say we're boycotting this, we can put a little bit of pressure, but it's not to the point where people are afraid of offending the Black community because it'll affect their bottom line. We're not at that point yet. And we have to get to that point, because people are afraid. They're afraid of gays. They're afraid of a lot of different communities that are a lot smaller and that do not have the history of oppression that we have in this country. And so we got to figure out, how do we apply that pressure?
I think the NFL is feeling it.
It's kind of a slippery slope too, though, Daniel, if I might interject. Because you think about the role of business, right? There's a study that just came out where they examined the nature of politics in this country. And they determined that, like, over the last several hundred years, that pretty much every major policy decision that was being contested in the public was ultimately won by business interests. And historically, those business interests have been conservative and oftentimes racist. And we look at organizations run by the Koch brothers, right? And their influence on politics. So it can be a slippery slope. I also saw a diagram.
That's exactly my point, right? Is the problem is the people who are in charge of those businesses are not the people that have a vested interest in our community's success, right? And so we need people in those positions of influence and power to find a way to leverage those organizations to fight for the causes that matter to us, right? And I think that's where it becomes important that we have people who are successful, we have people who are rising through these companies, right? And one of the challenges we see, at least in corporate America, is we struggle with getting people to these companies, right? We struggle with getting them to stay in these companies, and we struggle with getting them promoted in these companies, right? So even though we have some Black people in a company, they're not in positions of power yet. They're not in positions of influence. They can't change the conversation. They can't even really approach the conversation because it's taboo. They're not secure in their position to even have that conversation because they're afraid of, well, if I speak out and they don't like what I'm saying, then what happens to me, right? And that's because there's not generational wealth, right? That's because they're probably the first in their family to be in that position. So they have to they have so many people that are riding on them to be successful that they're risk adverse in that. So that's why we need more people, right? So the more people that we have in these positions, and that's across the board, right? Is the more that we have there, the better that will be in changing those conversations and changing those policies.
So I have a question for both you and Kimani. I don't know, Kimani, you probably know Killer Mike, the rapper Killer Mike. Are you familiar with him too, Daniel?
Yes,
so I saw an interview with him recently where he was talking about legitimizing gangs like the Bloods and the Crips. And he used, what's the white motorcycle gang, the Hell's Angels? Yeah. He used them as an example of how, they started off as this band of thugs, right? And ultimately became legitimized, and now they have businesses and, economic prosperity, and they have footing in the community, and they have, all of these things. And he was saying with the Bloods and the Crips, like, look, you guys have a national network, you have a brand, right? And these are key elements to establishing a business. So he came out with this product called Cripicola. Mm-hmm. And he's like, even though Coca-Cola and Pepsi and all of these brands of sodas do so much detriment to our health, and particularly in the Black community, where we, I think, consume a disproportionate amount of sodas, right? And it affects like sugar and diabetes and all of that. He said, if people are buying it and people are hooked on it, why not make the money off of it and invest it back in our own community? So they came up with this product called Cripicola, and they're selling that, but as like the first product line, right? As sort of like a gateway product into commercializing and monetizing the name and the brand of Crips and Bloods. And I'm wondering what you guys think about that.
So I have mixed feelings on that. I understand the logic behind it. I think it's addressing sort of, it's not addressing the actual cause of the issue, right? Why do people actually join gangs, right? They join gangs because they don't have, whether it's a support system, they don't have male father figures, brothers. They're looking for a support system, right? That is ultimately why people join gangs. They're looking for opportunities. They're in an area where they don't have economic opportunities or access to economic opportunities. And these are the only people who have money or who they can see as role models that like, hey, I want to be like this person because look at what they have, or look at what they're doing, or look at how they're respected or feared, or whatever word you want to use to describe it. And so, yes, the concept of we need to find and legitimize organizations that are bringing people together is good in theory, but I don't know if the Bloods and the Crips are the organizations that we want to sort of legitimize and make that, right? I think we need to figure out how do we create or replicate the model, right, that provides support to these young men, that provides, a sense of like economic opportunity or future or hope or something that inspires them, that they say, you know what, I don't need to go down that path, right? This is a path that I want. And so I think we need to just address that part and then figure out how do we just take that recruiting tool from the Bloods and the Crips, right? Because as we've seen historically, right? I mean, you don't go down that lifestyle and come out successful. We've not seen almost anybody who's gone down that path, stayed there and come out successful on the back end, right? So I get the concept. I don't necessarily think that is, if we're going to, if we have a limited amount of time, money, energy, and resources, I don't know if that's where I would recommend we put our resources.
Yeah, I
agree. Go, Kimani, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I go back and forth with that too. It makes more sense and it deals with the issue and the problem if we, spend more money on education and the youth. The issue with that to me is that the youth are being also mentored by their father figures, their uncles, those other people who are in the gangs now. So to give them something to hold on to, maybe it's not a if or, it's both, because to give them another opportunity to monetize something and bring that money into the community and create those opportunities for their own sons and daughters, I think it would be a good thing to turn it on its head and make it so it's a profitable thing for everybody,
What the question that comes to mind for me is, I wonder what those institutions will look like 50 years from now or 75 years from now. So if you think about Kennedy family, right? President Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, excuse me. And if you think about like their grandfather was a bootlegger. When you think about Donald Trump, his grandfather was a bootlegger. So there's a lot of people who are in prominent positions today and legitimate businesses today that didn't start off that way. And so, like, I have a real problem, an ethical problem with funding anybody who is involved in criminal activity, particularly of a violent nature, where they are killing other people or, wreaking havoc in neighborhoods. I don't support that at all. But I also wonder what would happen 1, 2, 3 generations down the road if folks would even still be involved. If they would no longer even be a gang where drugs and, drive-bys and all of that would become a thing of the past, and they would just become literally the next Coca-Cola or the next president of the United States.
Right.
Well, actually, to that point, I've been heavily involved in the cannabis industry, throughout the years, and it started as a street dealer, and now that cannabis is legal and the industry is coming along and legitimizing, a lot of the people that I know are switching over in that same manner. And I think something like that, even with the Cripicola, as silly as it might sound, could help do that and change people's minds and their trajectories,
When if we have the most prominent example I can think of, right? I'm a big Jay-Z fan. Jay-Z's children and grandchildren will likely not have to do the things that he had to do as a youth to make money, right? To get to the position that he's in. And if you listen to sort of his music and Beyonce's music, they do spread that message of like, I want my children's children to be wealthy, right? And so I think we just don't have the numbers of people who are in that position, who are able to take whatever their unfortunate circumstances were when they were growing up and turn that into something positive. A lot of times because they just don't make it that long to be able to make that conversion. But I think we will see more and more of that, where you have people who, grew up a certain way, but then, legacy-wise, they're creating these families that are doing well. But we need more of them, right? I don't know if we have enough of them, right? But if you look at maybe the children of some of these successful athletes, right, who, their kids are able to go to school, they may not have to be athletes, they can do other things. I think we're going to see that in a bunch of different areas.
Yeah, it's definitely blossoming right now. The opportunities are definitely opening up because of the wealth that, the basketball players, the baseball players, the movie stars, the music industry people, what I'm saying? I see it. And I as a hip hop head, I've seen the trend go from I'm on the block all the time to I'm on the block, but then I'm building my business and my brand at the same time. And the kids who are coming up are learning that and more than the gangs. Even the Crips and the Bloods nowadays aren't necessary. I mean, they're Crips and Bloods, but Crips and Bloods hang out now. Crips and Bloods start businesses together now. So the economic opportunities are getting through to people's heads. I'm definitely optimistic about that.
And I think the realization that there is enough to go around, right? I mean, I don't think it is not a zero-sum game of if I make $5, you lose $5, right? We can both make $5, right? There's enough money, there's enough needs, there's enough people. Neither of us has to take money out of the other pocket, right? And so it's that feeling of, or that sense of collaboration, right? And it goes back to earlier, that sense of working together, whether it's for a higher cause or higher purpose or whatever it is, but people coming together to, try and better the community, there's potential there.
Definitely.
So on that note, I want to, we've been talking about like some really high level conceptual, things here. And I want to kind of tie that back to the personal. And I'm curious to know, your experience, Daniel, coming up, pursuing a career, in business, working for, one of the most important consulting firms in the world. What has it been like for you as you've struck out to make your mark in the world and to be your own man and to hold your own in a predominantly white male business world?
Yeah. So, I benefit from a number of privileges, right? And I think any conversation around this in particular, I try to make sure that I acknowledge that I come from a privileged background, right? So, my father went to college, right? My mother was a nurse. She went to nursing school. Both sides of the family had college educated people before me, right? So in my family, college wasn't this lofty thing that it was a thing you do, like that you were expected to do, and you weren't really given pats on the back for like going to college, right, and wanting to be something. It was kind of the expectation. And I think that changes how you look at life when you're just expected to kind of achieve and to do more and to be better than the generation before you, right? My dad's whole goal was, I want you to go to a better school than me, and I want you to get a graduate degree, right? And one could argue whether I really needed a graduate degree or not, but that was his whole point, was I want you to be better than me, right? And that's kind of what he instilled in me. So going to Ghana, going to an international school where I went to class with people who were children of, CEOs of companies, their parents were diplomats, their parents were, senior people in the government of Ghana at the time. It just exposed me to things that had I stayed in LA, I would have never seen, I would have never experienced, right? I would have never realized that that is where the ceiling is, right? And my limited view of what I thought was, possible in the world expanded so broadly when I was around these people who were kind of like me, right? I mean, they're just kids, their parents, they were normal. We were about as smart. They weren't so much smarter than me or so much dumber than me. Like, we were around the same, abilities, right? And so just knowing that if they can aspire to be, the heads of companies or whatever, so could I. And so, I had always wanted to be a lawyer. That was kind of my passion from when I was a kid. I loved all the legal shows, just thought I was going to go into that. Went to school in Massachusetts, went to UMass Amherst, and did an internship my senior year of college at a law office on campus. And I hated it. I hated everything about it. And it was like, oh, I can't do this with my life right now. And that's a hard decision to come to in your senior year when you're not sure what you're going to do after you graduate. You're not sure how you're going to pay for it, right? Or how you're going to survive and live. Because my dad was not the person who's like, well, don't worry, son, just try and figure your life out and I'll make sure that you're comfortable until then, right? He was very much like, you're on your own. Like, you're an adult now, you got to figure it out. And so, I had a couple of different choices, and I applied for a job at a bank in Boston. And then I was doing alumni relations, and I had a chance to continue working on campus doing alumni relations. And I talked to a few different friends, and some of them were like, hey, if you move to Boston, your cost of living is going to go up significantly, right? You're making a little bit more money, but you're not going to be making that much more money that it's going to cover the cost. And so, quick maths, you're able to do some addition and subtraction, and you realize I'm going to have a better quality of life or more money if I stay right now and kind of figure my life out. So that's what I did. I worked on campus for a year, meeting alumni, hearing their story, and just realizing that people don't have it figured out when they graduate from college, and people have very different paths to where they ultimately get to and how they get there. And so it really took a lot of the pressure off of me to, you have to have it figured out. You have to have a job. You need to be, doing all these things right now. And it afforded me some patience. Friend of a friend got a job in DC and was like, hey, you should come down to DC. They're looking for Black people who studied economics, or business, you fall in that category. And so that's what I did. Friend of a friend got me a job, and I ended up moving down to DC and started working in consulting in DC. And this was 2007, right before Obama got elected. And it was just a magical time to be in DC, right? I mean, there were so many Black people coming there. The inauguration was amazing. And there was this spirit of like, things are about to happen, right? You don't know what is going to happen. You don't know how, but you just know that like, we really bought into the whole, change is going to come. So yeah, I lived in DC for 3 years, and I struggled. I struggled with work. I struggled with how to succeed. Part of it was probably on me, right? And I think there's that growth element that I try to, share stories with other people. Part of it was the supervisors that I had. I don't know if they were as invested in my success as I would have wanted them to be. But looking back on it, I don't know if that is we want it to be their responsibility, but I don't know if it's really their responsibility, right? They have a job to do. They have, responsibilities and obligations to clients and things like that. So they're just like, I need somebody who's going to do what I need them to do, right? And so I realized that there's a disconnect in some ways between, you come out of school, you're smart. I've been around different circles, but I'd never been in a client service client-facing role where people have expectations of me and all those things. And that presented new challenges that I just was not prepared to handle all the time. So that didn't go as well as I wanted, but I got a bunch of great opportunities, a bunch of great experience, had a wonderful time in DC, went to grad school, wanted to go to international school, figure my life out, travel the world a little bit. So I did that. So I moved out to the Bay Area, then ended up in Dubai and Shanghai for a little bit. Amazing countries, very different, not democracies, but you just see what they're able to do. So yeah, so did that, wonderful, and then got to Accenture 7 years ago. And when I got to Accenture, I struggled in the beginning. I was not a technology person. I joke, I had an iPhone and that was about my experience with technology. And they're discussing all these complicated things. And I did not get it. I did not understand it. I did not know. And I had a difference in approach this time, right? And I was like, I'm going to work really hard and figure this out, right? And this is where the twice as hard comes in, is that I was studying, I was processing, I was trying to figure it out, I was asking questions. And yes, I wasn't the social person in the beginning. I wasn't the everybody knows me and loves me, right? It was just I'm struggling with this thing, but I'm going to figure it out. And there was a kid that I started with who was not struggling with it, right? And so there was that, comparison of hey, Daniel doesn't get it, but this other kid gets it, right? Do we need Daniel around, right? And luckily for me, my boss was the Vietnamese lady who was like, no, I'm a big believer in diversity. I think he's smart and capable. I'm going to keep believing in him. And so she did. And so because of that, I stuck around a little bit longer, just enough for me to kind of make that breakthrough, right? And I think that that's important when you have somebody who is you may not get it now, but I can see that you're capable. I'm going to give you a little bit of leeway. I'm going to trust in you, and I'm going to hope that you figure it out. And I'm going to help you with the resources, right? If you need stuff, I will give it to you. And so I think that's why I really appreciated my time at Accenture so far, is that I've had people who I felt were invested in my success. I've had people who I felt gave me the chance to work and fail and learn and grow and progress. And I think that's what people are looking for, right? People want to be in situations where they're given the opportunity to do work, they're given the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to keep progressing in their career. And so I remember she wanted me, we were starting a diversity initiative on the account, and I know I'm going a little long-winded here, but she started a diversity initiative on the account, and she was like, hey, I want you to lead, the African American Employee Resource Group. And I was like, I don't want to be that guy, right? I don't want to be that Black guy who is, whatever, right? And she had this really incredulous look on her face. She was like, but you are that guy. And in that moment, you recognize that you can decide, hey, you know what? I don't want to take on that responsibility, right? Somebody else should do it. I just want to focus on my work. I want to fit in. I don't want to rock the boat, whatever the reasoning or excuse is. Or you can recognize, but I am that guy, right? And so I was. And so I did it. And, then it expanded, and I started leading not just on the account, but all of Northern California. And we've done a number of different things, initiatives. I think there's more that we can do, right? I think there's more that we have to figure out. But I think trying to provide an opportunity or space for people to ask questions, to get help, to get feedback, to get advice, to have somebody who's been through it to kind of mentor them around don't do this, this is how you handle this, don't say this, say it like this, frame it this way, I think has been really important. And so people have done that for me. I try to do that for others, and I try to make sure that there's other people who are there supporting them. So I think, I've been very fortunate that I've been at Accenture and I feel supported. I'm sure you can ask 10 other Black people and they will tell you, I have not felt supported. I have not been able to grow and progress that I wanted. I have not felt like there are the resources there, people invested in my career. And I don't know how you bridge those two experiences, right? And I don't know, because I know what that was like when I was in DC, right? So I know that feeling. But I've been lucky that I've had that opportunity here. But it's a big company, right? There's 4,000 or 5,000 people in the Bay Area. I'm not aligned to all the different groups. I can't help everybody out. And so we have to figure out from a systemic way, what are the ways that we support them? And so that's kind of what we're really focused on. It's just, how do we, continue the conversation and make people aware of these are the things that people need, and they need that support. They need to be able to have conversations. They need feedback. It's not to say don't give them feedback, right? But it's being mindful of the feedback you're giving them. Is this, would you tell a white person this, right? Would you tell a white woman this? Would you tell a Black, and if you're not going to give the same advice, then like, ask yourself why you're giving that advice then, right? And what is behind that? And that's a hard conversation. I don't know if we're really able to turn the corner on that one yet. But I've been extremely fortunate throughout my life, I think, to just have people who I feel like have been there for me. So that's kind of my experience. And I'm just trying to, keep progressing as far as I can go in my career and then keep helping others out.
Yeah, I feel kind of the same way. Maybe not in the business end, but as far as just being amongst my friends, being a little more aware of what needs to be done in my life to help them see the bigger picture, and pushing them in those directions, talking a little bit of politics. I have a friend who hates politics. Anytime politics is brought up, shut up. I don't want to talk about it. Like, shut up. Like he was on my job site. I hired him for a job, and he tried to tell me to shut up. And I'm like, no, you're gonna have to listen. This is my job site. You're gonna have to listen to what I'm saying, right? And I don't try to push a certain agenda on them, but just mainly just you should be out there voting, which is a big one, which is one of the biggest. Be out there voting, and I make sure that I use that to talk to my kids, my wife, my friends, my family. And I think those things, just being aware that you're in a position in these positions that we're saying we need in our community to uplift us, that we are those people, and we need to use our voices for those who are aware,
Yeah. And, I think we've done a number of initiatives. We have this series called Building Bridges, where we have discussions on race and all these various diversity topics, right? So women, religion, sexuality, et cetera. And, one of the conversations around race, it's really around, we need to start having grace when having these conversations, right? It is not I need to make a point and win the argument kind of thing anymore, right? We need to get to the point where this is my lived experience, right? This is what I struggle with sometimes. This is where I sometimes don't feel like I belong, right? And then feeling like the listener is really trying to listen to you and hear, man, I didn't know you felt that way, right? I didn't know that that's how my actions may have been coming across, right? And that's not malicious. It's not intentional. It could just be, you just had no idea, right? And then it's, okay, well, what do we do now to make sure that people feel included? Let's go to lunch together, right? Let's meet outside of just the day-to-day work meeting, so that I know a little bit about your background and I know your struggle that you had. And then you find out this is the first person in their family to go to college. And this is the first person in their family to work in a professional setting, right? And so those normal social things that maybe you learned from your father when they taught you about how to always take notes in a meeting or whatever it is, right? This person didn't have that opportunity, right? So when you're assessing them or when you're giving them feedback, then you're mindful of that and saying, oh, you know what? I'm going to give them the benefit out. They probably just don't know, right? And it's not a deficiency on their part. I just need to tell them, hey, when you go to this meeting, always bring a notebook with you, always take notes. You know what I mean? And it's those little things that, count against people unknowingly. And then they rank them at the end of the year and they say, oh, this person is better than that person. And it's like, well, why are they better? And it's these really small, subtle things that you're like, all right, I mean, I don't know if that should disqualify them, right? And so I think, these conversations are important, and having them with diverse audiences, right? It shouldn't just be Black people discussing race, right? I think by and large, we get it. Whether we feel as strongly one way or another, we kind of get it, right? But it's our colleagues, it's our bosses, it's our leaders who need to have these conversations as well.
Yeah.
Daniel, I'm curious, when you first took over the employee resource group, were there certain things that you did to get up to speed to feel like you could steer these conversations, facilitate them, and add value?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think part of it is you have to find your voice, right? And that was a struggle for me in the beginning, because I just wasn't sure, well, what is my voice, right? What is my position, right? And I think through the years, whether it's maturing, whether it's becoming more senior in my role, whatever it is, right? It's a combination of all of those things. And it's just having conversations with people. I feel like I've developed my voice a bit where I'm more aware. I'm hopefully more educated or more informed when I'm speaking on some of these topics. And I'm not a historian, right? So I don't have every fact just, to be able to recall. But I think from a general theme perspective, right? I think it's speaking to the things that another person can hear, right? And that's the thing with communication is you have to speak for other people to hear, right? So it's less about like, what do I want to say, but like, what do I want them to take away? What do I want them to hear? And if I want them to hear that, hey, there are things that are going on that are not your fault, you had nothing to do with it, and they still exist, and you have an opportunity to help fix them, then I need to frame it in that way versus you have white privilege and you are oppressing people and you don't need to do this, and this, right? Because they're not going to hear past they have white privilege, right? And that ends the conversation for them there, right? Because now you're blaming them for racism. Like in their mind, they're hearing, you're blaming me for racism, you're blaming me for Jim Crow, you're blaming me for slavery, you're blaming me for all these things that I had nothing to do with.
Yeah.
And they're never going to contribute or support your causes when that is the tenor of the conversation, right? So it is, hey, these are the challenges that these people are facing, right? We need mentors. We need people who are advocates. We need people who are giving them feedback and guidance, right? And this is an apprenticeship organization. Like you have to learn by doing. You will not be able to get good at any of these things by just reading it in a book somewhere, right? So those are kind of things that I've learned, and I try to have grace when having these conversations, that I'm not blaming somebody, right? But I'm bringing up points to help them think about, like, are you being consistent in how you're providing feedback, criticizing something, whatever, right? When you criticize LeBron James for being overly emotional, do you levy the same criticism against Tom Brady?
Yeah.
If not, why? Why is Tom Brady passionate, and why do you view LeBron James a different way, right?
Yeah. And
then you have to explain that, right? And it's like, well, because this, and this. Okay, but they're both emotional, demonstrative people. So why is that acceptable, right? And sometimes it gets uncomfortable, right? Because then they have to really think about, well, why do I view that this way, right? And maybe it's, hey, I'm from Boston and I love Boston teams, and I'm not from Cleveland, so I don't support him, which is fine. But if it's more than that, then you need to start thinking like, well, why is it that, right? And I think because of just the stigma, the stereotypes, historical, whatever you want to call it, Black men sometimes feel like, hey, I can't be a certain way in public because I don't want to be perceived as the angry, aggressive, whatever you want to call it, right? And that's hard too, right? Because you can't just, you are not being your authentic self, right? And you're not able to really succeed and thrive if you have to now figure out, how do I be myself within these, confines of what somebody else expects of me, because then I don't want to offend them, right? So it's having that conversation, and it's trying to have it with grace, and this is where it becomes double the work, right? Because a white person may be able to go in the conversation and not think twice about like what they say, how they frame it, how it'll hurt you. Will you hear it? Will you not hear it? Will you think about it all night and not sleep? They don't have to worry about that, right? But I have to think about, like, how do I frame this in a way that doesn't offend you, but still gets my point across, and hopefully you hear it and want to help out. So, I think it's kind of my perspective on it.
You just kind of framed my whole life. Growing up in Marin County, I grew up around predominantly white people. I have to tiptoe around it and to keep them in the conversation instead of scaring them away from it.
Yeah.
And growing up as a Black man, especially out here, I'm not the tallest guy. I'm 5'10". I'm not that imposing, but let everybody else tell it. I'm the scariest dude who walks in the room when I walk in the room. And then don't let us start having a passionate conversation about arguing my point. Then everyone's like, "Oh my God, just relax." And I'm like, "Well, what? I'm not even angry or emotional. I'm just."
The hard part is you're passionate about these topics, and you have to discuss it in this very calm, neutral, comforting, non-confrontational, non-aggressive, all these things way, so that somebody is not threatened by the conversation, right?
Yeah.
And that is a hard thing. It is a hard thing. And I've struggled with it. I've had conversations where I was not calm throughout the conversation. But I've learned through the years to try and be calmer, right? And to just make it less around what I think, but just trying to provide examples so that they're able to really challenge their thinking around how they feel about something, right?
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. I remember when, I'm forgetting his name now. This was right before the Orlando shooting, the Atlanta nightclub shooting. But the father was shot, and the next day they had a press conference. It was a Monday when I went to work, and there was a press conference, and the kid was just in pain. And I watched it at work, and I was just, it affected me, right? And it affected me on so many different levels. And I just remember, I think I ended up posting on Facebook that like, this is heartbreaking, right? Like, this is just heartbreaking. And I got into a conversation with somebody from grad school, and it started off, you know, kind of normal. It started off like we were discussing the issue, right? And then it kind of took a turn, and it was a morning where I was too emotional, and I was not prepared for him to try and debate me around like this thing and try and make it anything more than this is a really heartbreaking situation that I don't believe needed to happen. Mm-hmm. And yeah, eventually it went really left, right? Fast forward about an hour or so later, you know, a couple of coworkers that I was friends with on Facebook had seen it. And they actually asked me like, hey, are you okay? Like, you know, that was kind of messed up what the guy did in the conversation. And so people were reading it. People were paying attention to like the back and forth. And I'm not normally a back and forth online kind of person, but that morning I was not going to like allow him to just take over the conversation. Yeah. And you know, what was interesting about it was I was affected by that thing that I saw. And there were so many of my coworkers, whether maybe they were, and I just don't know. But so many people were able to just kind of go through the day and not be affected by it, right? Just kind of live their lives, right? Like, this thing happened, it's unfortunate, and I need to think about lunch. You know, I now need to like plan my day for the rest of the day and whatever they had to do. And so I think that there's that burden, right? That these things happen outside of work, and they affect us in various ways, right? And we then have to go to work and pretend that like we're okay, right? And then everything's fine, and I'm just head down getting stuff done. And that's hard. That is a really hard thing, right? And so figuring out ways to provide a support system in that, you know, and having people that you can talk to or contact, you know, I think all those things are important, and we got to figure out those ways to like make sure that we're continuing to be there for each other so that people can, you know, express and vent and share their frustrations and just discuss these things when they need to.
Yeah, as Black men, you know, we're not supposed to show those emotions.
Right.
Deal with it. You
right.
know, move past it.
Right.
And take care of it, handle it.
Right.
Oh man, you know what I'm saying? I think honestly, and as growing older and getting more perspective on being a man in general, I've realized, and I see this happening more and it's coming out more in our community, but Black people are starting to realize being a man is being able to deal with your emotions, to be able to express your emotions in a productive way, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think it's definitely getting better. And I think that's one thing that's kind of holding the growth of Black men back, is not being able to deal with those things, talk to their friends and get constructive criticism and all that stuff, you know, and those things help you grow when you get another opinion, when you get another perspective, I think it's definitely getting better with that though.
Yeah. And as tough as we as Black men are, we have to be able to take feedback. We're not perfect, right? And I think, I'm sure everybody struggles with this, but particularly in our communities, we struggle with getting feedback. Hey, you need to do this differently. You need to do this better, right? Yeah. You're a hater. You don't want to see me shine. You don't want to see me, you know. And maybe it's just things that we need to be mindful of, right? And maybe it's not all the time, but it's certain times we need to be mindful of the way we talk, the way we act, the way we do certain things in certain situations. And we need to be open to that kind of feedback. And I don't know if we're always there yet and we're always ready to be open to that kind of feedback to help us grow. And I think that that's going to be important for us. And one could argue maybe it's because there's people who didn't get the feedback growing up, right? They didn't have somebody who was like, hey, you're going down the wrong path. You're doing this incorrectly. Do it this way, this and that, right? And so people are just not used to getting that kind of feedback. And so it becomes hard when you grow up and somebody's telling you, don't do it like this, do it like this. And you're like, and that stunts our growth sometimes, right? Because people become scared. And so then they don't tell us when we're doing the wrong thing. And then we don't know that we're doing the wrong thing. And then eventually they're just like, it's not working out, right? And there was a series of things that led to it's not working out, but they were too afraid to tell us because they were afraid that we wouldn't be able to handle the conversation.
True.
I think both of you guys have just made some really critically important points. And it kind of goes back to one of our previous conversations, Kimani, when we were talking to Mayor Torrance Harvey, and he pointed out, we start talking about Maslow's pyramid and the hierarchy of needs and how the top of that is self-realization.
Yeah.
Self-realization doesn't happen without self-reflection. Yeah. And it doesn't happen without being able to get that reflection from other people in our community who are reflecting back to us our own, weaknesses and where we need to grow and strengthen. And we have to have these conversations, particularly for Black men. And that's part of the reason why this project is happening, because both Kimani and I realize that not so much pain in the Black community, particularly with Black men, but there's no opportunity. There's virtually no opportunity for you guys to talk. Nobody asks men how they feel, and they especially don't ask Black men how they feel. And most people are too afraid, like you pointed out, for one reason or another, either because they fear Black men in general, and anything you say when you become impassioned about something, they feel threatened by it, or because Black men are typically in so much pain. And so your identity, or our identity as Black people as a whole, but particularly for the male, because you guys have been under assault so much more intensely, is that your sense of identity is so fragile, and sense of personal value and self-esteem is so fragile that every criticism or every reflection of constructive criticism is taken as another assault. And so it's met with this backlash, right, and this defensiveness, and it shuts down conversation. And wrapping up this conversation, I just, want to say how much I appreciate you guys and your feedback, and how much I'm really hoping that this will be a platform that can facilitate some of those things and overcome those hurdles, not only for the people that Kimani and I sit down and talk to, but for all the people listening, right? The people who will never get a chance to meet somebody like Daniel Cole in person because they don't even have access to somebody in a professional position or somebody with your level of education. I'm hoping that this is going to touch the hearts and minds of so many people. And forgive me, I'm overcoming a cold here, like in the tail end, so I had a little coughing spasm. I'm hoping that it'll facilitate a whole lot of other conversations that are happening in other people's living rooms, to be perfectly honest, and that this will, I don't want to say I'm starting a movement, but if it does catch fire and it triggers people to have these kind of really important conversations in their families, with their friends, in their communities, and then maybe also in their workplaces as well, in their churches. And we all know that churches are highly segregated, probably where these conversations need to happen the most. I will feel like I've done my work on earth if, if it does take off and promote that kind of healing in our communities. So I just want to say thank you for just taking your time and sharing so much. I got so much value out of this, Daniel. Yeah. I love it when I'm not the smartest person in the room and I get to sit back and just listen and learn.
I don't know if I'm the smartest person in this room.
You're definitely smarter than me. I'll just go ahead and vouch for that. But I learned a lot from you, and I really respect you and I appreciate you, not just for the time that you've given us today, but for all the work that you're doing at Accenture. And I know it goes beyond that because I can see that you just have a heart for it, So thank you.
And I thank you guys. I mean, I think this is really this is powerful stuff, right? And I think sometimes it starts with a conversation, right? And it starts with a couple of conversations, and it starts with a bunch of ideas. And and consulting, that's a lot of what we do, right? Is we start brainstorming, we figure out there's a problem, we start throwing around ideas. Next thing you know, there's a proposal. Next thing you know, we're trying to sell work and we're trying to solve a client problem. And so this is the first step, right? Is just having these conversations, crowdsourcing a bunch of ideas, and figuring out what are actionable things we can do, right? And I think it's working in our little communities, right? It's trying to be examples for other people. It's trying to work with those coming after us. And it's also working with those who are around us to say, what can we do, right? How can we talk to you? I'm here for you. I want to hear for you. Are you okay? What's going on? How do you feel? So I think this is critically important conversation. I thank you guys for starting this.
Yeah, thanks for coming, man. All the feedback and the information I can get just helps me, and I really enjoy this, just like Shauna does, just like most people who want to talk about it do, because it's part of the healing,
Yeah.
and we all need some healing,
Absolutely.